Welcome to the ISTAT Learning Lab. Today we're going to talk about financing the transition to a sustainable system. And to do that, we have Jonathan Drew in our studio in Hong Kong. Jonathan is Managing Director of ESG Solutions for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. And he leads the ESG Solutions Group for the Global Banking Unit at HSBC. Jonathan graduated from Cambridge University in England with an MA in economics, and is also a certified chartered accountant. Jonathan started his banking career more than 20 years ago and has been in Hong Kong since 1997, there witnessing the amazing growth in Asia and notably in China. He's been involved in financing of projects that produce and deliver energy and transport people and resources from source to point of consumption, as well as a wide range of projects in manufacturing and social sectors with a focus on resource efficiency and sustainability. In recent years, Jonathan has also been responsible for the structuring and delivery of sustainable bonds and sustainable loans for corporate and institutional clients. Jonathan is a member of the executive committee of the Hong Kong Green Finance Association, and he also chairs the Asia Pacific Loan Market Association's Green and Sustainable Loan Committee. During this presentation, you can write in questions by clicking on the bottom of your screen, and I will go over those questions with Peter, together with my colleague in Singapore, Peter Neglin, who is the director of ISTAT, where he is responsible for ISTAT's online offering, and therefore he is actually my boss. Peter joined BOC Aviation in Singapore in 2008, and he's been the head of strategy and market research for the last 10 years. Before that, Peter was the CFO of an Asian-based low-cost carrier, and before that, he had 20 years of experience with different investment banks in Australia and in Asia, all in a research role. I also wanted to mention that we have another learning lab coming up on April 28th on the oil markets with Julian Lee. And with that, I hand over the microphone to Jonathan Drew in Hong Kong.
Niels, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you to you and to Peter for inviting me to talk to your group today. And of course, thank you to everybody, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you very much for joining this session. As Niels said, I look after this group here within the banking division at HSBC we call ESG Solutions, and its sort of mission and purpose is helping our corporate clients across all sectors in dealing with the financing needs to support the transition to a low carbon, low polluting and sustainable future. So having the opportunity to talk to your group is both a great privilege and also very much germane to what we do as a bank here at HSBC. So in the next sort of 45 or 50 minutes or so, I was just going to talk through a little bit of start a little bit of background on sort of how we as bankers see the challenge and therefore what needs to be done. Bring that into the context, obviously, of your industry, aircraft and airlines, and then talk a little bit about some of the financing solutions that we've seen applied already, but perhaps more important, think about sort of how finance as we go forward will be able to support this critical industry. So with that those sort of objectives set out, I wanted just to start with this picture, and this is the sort of a summary of the in a sense, the climate change challenge and the need to shift from an economic system today or where we are producing greenhouse gases that are driving temperatures ever higher. And if we don't stop that temperature rise pretty quickly, scientists are telling us that we are going to go beyond some very critical thresholds where we will not only start incurring some huge costs as a consequence of how our physical ecosystems will then start adversely impacting us, human beings, our species, and what we do on this planet, but also could go beyond tipping points where we get to sort of a runaway situation and we may simply never be able to control it. No technology may provide the solutions. And the pictures here come from an organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is actually an organization within the World Meteorological Organization that is really the body that collects and collates and produces consensus views of global scientific opinions on climate change. And they gather materials, projections, research from many institutions, many of the leading academic and other research institutions globally, and create this synthesis. So we just have a quick look at what we are seeing here. We're seeing temperature rises, and all of these I'm sure you'll be familiar, are based upon sort of versus a pre-industrialization baseline. We've already put enough greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we've seen temperature rises of about 1 degree centigrade. And the critical thresholds before we avoid these big costs are ideally 1.5 degrees, but absolutely we need to keep below 2 degrees. Once we go beyond 1.5, that's where we're going to start seeing the big costs coming in. Once we go beyond 2, that's where we start to see really fundamental and significant impacts. And for those of you who read about this, once we start going beyond 2, that's when it sort of becomes inevitable that we're going to lose both of the major land ice masses in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And when you melt all of that and push that into the sea, that's when we have sea level rises of more than 50 meters. It's at those temperatures where we fundamentally start to lose large parts of the cultivatable land mass through warming and drying, on which we depend upon for food, and we have constraints around water resources. So that's why sort of, at going beyond 2 and towards sort of 3 and even beyond that, we absolutely have to avoid that. So how we do that in the scientific sense is we need to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the biggest one is, of course, carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide has a very long shelf life or half-life when it gets into the atmosphere. And that's why on the graph on the sort of top right, you can see we have to get to 0, i.e. we have to make the cumulative curve go flat to ultimately stop temperature rises. This illustration then shows a number of different variations on that. But if you go to the bottom right here, you can see, I think graphically here, just how quickly we have to get to 0 if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that sort of transition from emitting more than 40 gigatons of CO2 per annum, which is where we are today, even notwithstanding that emissions may have been down 6 to 8% as a consequence of lockdown during a year of COVID, but to go from there to 0, that's radical, that's transformational by anybody's account. And of course, in the detail, it's not just CO2, there are other important gases like methane. If we can reduce methane, we can actually create a little bit of a cooling effect, and that's why the sort of the blue pathway generates some opportunity that even if we go a bit beyond 1.5, we can bring that back down. But once we start going beyond 2, those factors become much more questionable. So clearly here, the challenge is to bring emissions down significantly. And this is why we've now got this sort of enormously strong narrative globally about getting to zero or net zero, recognizing that there is some scope to actually, for our planet to sequester and for us to influence, particularly land areas where we can actually sequester some carbon. And that could be natural sinks, or we could invest in technological sinks, i.e. sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pumping it and storing it underground. So that's the concept of net zero. But you'll hear this race to net zero by 2050, which is the sort of broad approximation of those dates that we saw on the earlier curve. And we've now got more than 100 countries globally who've made in different forms commitments to get to net zero, and also a very rapidly growing list of organizations and institutions who are also committing to get to zero. Some of the airlines, banks like HSBC, other corporates as well. So in a sense, that's just the sort of the high level message. How do we get there? Well, we have to look at where the emissions come from. Of course, there are a lot of these are based and come from our largest economies. So you can see the country list at the top there. The sector breakdown, not surprisingly, you can see electric power and heat forms the largest single component. Although on other measures, if you aggregate our food systems and land use issues arising, or land use changes as a consequence of our changing and growing needs to grow food, the food sector can approach very closely to the contribution to greenhouse gases of electric power. And that does also, we do also have methane emissions from our food systems, and methane has much greater warming potential per molecule emitted into the atmosphere than CO2 does. So obviously there's a lot of complexity that I'm skipping over the top of. And as if you joined early and you saw the lead-in questions, you'll know that within that 16% for transport, about 12% of that is due to the airline industry or air travel. So the solution, of course, is actually a massive investment in decarbonizing all of these sectors. And that's in what we've got in the donuts there, both in terms of the sort of at the bottom, where that investment will need to go sector by sector. No surprise that transport sector is the biggest sector, because that's where, you know, we have a lot of the big capital cost items. Geographically, it's a global challenge, but a lot of this, more than 50% of this investment is likely to be required in the Asian region, which is obviously where I'm based. And part of that, of course, is because the challenge facing emerging markets, of which there are many in Asia, is the challenge to grow whilst reducing emissions. So the challenge in Asia is a very rapid, to achieve that, you have to have a very rapid reduction in carbon intensity of economic activity. So this is the global challenge. It's not just about transport, it's not just about airlines, it's across all sectors. The airline sector, though, of course, has recognized this, and this is not new in your sector. We can go back decades to look to the origins of the industry starting to address the challenge, whether that's starting to, you know, go into that complex negotiation around the reduction and offsets through CORSIA, to the announcements back in 2009 through IATA around flatlining carbon from 2020 and then getting to 50% of that carbon by 2050. I think if these numbers were run again today, the ambition would be set even higher. But of course, the airline industry is one of the challenge sectors, because in contrast to perhaps the electric power sector, where if you've got the resources, you've got a lot of technology options available to create renewable electric power, clearly and particularly in respect of long distance passenger air travel, the technology just isn't there today. So on the right hand side of this picture, this is just a summary, and I think it's quite a good summary from an organization called the Energy Transition Commission, which is based in the UK, of the different ways that our air travel can be decarbonized. And it's broken down into the sort of the three segments of demand management, energy efficiency, and then the new fuels. So on the demand management side, and this is as you would, I think, know probably better than I do, this is all about the sort of the in-air efficiencies of direct routings, as well as some on-ground traffic management opportunities, improving load factors, driving a greater efficiency and perhaps 15% reductions. Obviously, on the demand side, there's the question around modal shift, and of course, post-COVID, the question as to sort of how will demand have been impacted, because we now are all much more fluent and capable in these types of interactions that might have an impact on long-term demand for business travel and so forth. So we've got that bucket one, 15% from demand management. Then in terms of machine efficiency, 30 to 45% there through better design, more efficient turbines and so forth. Those two really sort of adding up to the perhaps a half, and then to go beyond that, obviously where there's a lot of focus now on R&D and so forth on sustainable aircraft fuels. And obviously to the extent that they can become zero carbon, whether it's through biofuels, whether it's through hydrogen injected direct into turbines, or the electrification solutions, whether that's sort of hydrogen fuel cells to power electric turbines, or whether it's battery storage powering electric turbines. Those technologies are all, as the sort of the bars on the right hand side show, at different stages of viability and commerciality. So in a sense, this is just sort of bringing the challenge into your sector, but then of course sort of moving into, well, what's the role for finance? What's the role for HSBC specifically? And I talked about institutions making commitments to zero. That's what we've done. We've gone out there and said we're going to get our own operations to zero by 2030, and we're going to get our so-called financed emissions, which is looking through our lending book, to be net zero, or to align to net zero by 2050, i.e. we only want to be lending to borrowers who in their business are aligning their business to get to net zero by 2050. And there are a lot of financial institutions, there's a lot of institutional money who are now making similar commitments. And of course, there are multiple ways in which we're doing there. They're sort of putting people to the task, like sort of my little group. There are bringing new solutions. So we're looking at creating vehicles to scale up natural capital solutions through this HSBC Pollination joint venture. We've got capital going into clean tech investment funds, and also working together with some of our philanthropic foundational work to unlock climate solutions. So this is our commitment. And why are we doing it? Because we recognize that if this doesn't happen, this is a societal challenge. It's a systemic risk. So we want to lead, we want to drive, because that's actually going to be good for our business. The disaster scenarios where society fails, it's somewhat inevitable that, in a sense, we all struggle, and that slow degradation of society, if we fail to transition, is a scenario that we are very committed and determined to play our part and make sure that society avoids. So that's just a little bit on HSBC. Obviously, one of the ways we do this is through as an intermediary in the capital markets. And here we talk about our role in the bond market. And these are the labeled bond markets. And I'll talk a little bit about the product definitions in a moment. But we're talking here about sustainable, green, social, and sustainable bonds. These are use of proceeds bonds. So a green bond is a bond where the use of proceeds is to go to a project that delivers, or a business that delivers, environmental benefits. Social bond delivers social benefits. Sustainability bond is where there are both green and social benefits. The other product in here, and this market's often referred to as the GSSS market, the GSSS market, is the new kid on the block, which is the sustainability linked bonds. These are not use of proceeds bonds, but these are where you have in the payout mechanism under the financing transaction an incentive for the issuer to improve its sustainability performance. And as we'll see in a minute, if it's generally a target that's set, and there's a penalty that the issuer pays if they fail to meet a target. So this is the sort of what the bond market looks like. You can see volumes in 2020 reached 573 billion. You can see from the growing bars, there's healthy growth across the sectors there. To put the 573 in context, because it's a big number that doesn't mean much without putting it in context, that was about 5% of total fixed income issuance in 2020. So if just to put some numbers on the size of the capital markets, the total pool of investable capital in the international institution markets, order of magnitude is roughly $200 trillion. It's about 120 fixed income, 80 in equity and sort of alternative type structured in investments. These are the annual flows. So if you take 20 times 500 billion, you've got the annual turnover, and then compare that back to the numbers we saw on the earlier picture about the volume of spend required to over the sort of the 15-year period, which is this critical period to transition to zero. That was, you remember the number on that side is about $100 trillion across all of those sectors, i.e. about 8 trillion per annum. So we need to be moving somewhere like just 4% of the total capital pool each year into driving sustainable investments to meet the transitional challenge. So the message is, it's very possible. There is not a shortage of capital. We have the capital. We have many of the technologies. Obviously, as we talked about before, we're at different stages across different sectors, but we have many of the technologies that can get us there, and we have a very good prospect of developing or discovering the technologies that are going to fill in those gaps. So this is very doable, but if it is to be achieved, it's going to need some radical changes in thinking and changes in behavior. Just to put some context also on the loan market, because we're talking about sort of capital, public bond markets there. Loan market, again, volumes showing similar trends up to 240 billion globally. So it's slightly smaller than the bond market. The principles for the loan market were introduced really in 2018, 2019, so it came in a little bit after bond market, but we've seen very quick growth. And you can see for the sort of the sector analysis here, we've got a very broad range of sectors where green and sustainable loans are being applied. One of the differences you might pick up from the bars on the bottom left is that in the loan market, the sustainability linked loan is dominating. 80% of the volume is sustainability linked, i.e. where you've got the incentive mechanism, versus about 20%, which is the use of proceeds. If you remember back to the previous pie in the bond market, it's very much the other way around. The sustainability-linked bond, the principles only came in June 2020, and I think in the 2020 numbers, the sustainability-linked bonds were approximately about 4% of the total GSS bond market. What's remarkable, though, about the bond market is what's happened in the 3 months since the end of the year. I'll just go back to that for a moment. 573 billion in fiscal 2020 or calendar 2020. In the first 3 months of 2021, the volumes have reached about 250 billion already. So even I can extend that, extrapolate that to an annual total of nearly $1 trillion. So we are seeing exponential growth in these markets, because what we believe is happening here is that institutional money, bank money, has been actively seeking places to invest sustainably, and now issuers and borrowers are switching on that if they want to effectively access the capital markets, you have to have and tell a credible and compelling sustainability story to make sure you get best access to markets. And we'll see that in a moment. But perhaps for those of you who are not so familiar with the products, just a quick summary on how the products work. So this graphic here is all about the use of proceeds product. So it's the green bonds, it's the green loans, it's the social bonds and the social loans. There are a series of market principles. So the bonds are typically governed by a committee that's managed by the International Capital Markets Association. It's market driven. So you've got representatives from issuers, investors, and intermediaries on that committee. In the loan market, again, you've got banks and you've got corporates operating through the global loan market associations, creating these market-driven principles. And there are these 4 core components that a loan needs to comply with if it's to be called green, or a bond needs to comply with if it's to be called green. The principal one, as I've emphasized already, is the use of proceeds. So that's pillar 1. And then the other 3 pillars are what we generally refer to as the sort of the governance pillars around evaluation of the environmental benefits. You know, what standards, what metrics are used to assess those benefits. There needs to be a funds tracking process so that, you know, when the bond or the loan is issued, the investor knows where the funds are going. So there needs to be a tracking system. And then critically, to understand that the monies have actually gone to green benefit, that green usage, there needs to be a comprehensive set of reporting, not only on the allocation of the funds, but also the issuer or the borrower's own estimates of what the environmental benefits were. So when you go to market with one of these trades, you'll see issuers and borrowers will go out. There'll be a framework which will address each of these 4 pillars. And then often with that framework, there is something called an external review. And I'll touch on in a moment how those get put together. But this is the concept. Use of proceeds is key, and attached to both the green loan principles, well, all of the principles are typical use of proceeds categories. And no surprise, it's investments or it's activities in all of those sectors that we saw earlier that is critical to driving the transition. So it's renewable energy, it's energy efficiency, of which a lot includes green buildings, but also in the technical space, it's clean transport coming to your sector, it's environmental services. And then also within the use of proceeds, the environmental use of proceeds categories, you've got, in addition to those climate mitigation use of proceeds, you've got climate adaptation categories, recognizing that given we've got 1 degree of warming, that we're very likely, almost unavoidable, that we'll get quite close to 1.5. We are going to need to invest in actually making our system more resilient. That's flood defenses, storm defenses, but also particularly investments in the agricultural sector, sort of to protect our crops and also to ensure that we have and preserve and maintain productivity as we go into variable climatic conditions. So, you know, very high moisture content in the soil from wet seasons to very low moisture content droughts and drying out of land as well. So a lot of investment in the agricultural space around adaptation to climate change. I won't talk too much about the social projects, but there are social bond principles. The social loan principles have just been announced this week, actually. They have broadly a similar structure, and that's all about proceeds being used to deliver benefits for a section of society that is can generally be considered to be disadvantaged, and often in the form of providing basic infrastructure or basic services. But also this sector grew very significantly, as you perhaps won't be surprised to hear, last year as a consequence of COVID and the application of capital to support those most adversely impacted by, or disadvantaged sections impacted by the lockdown as a consequence of COVID. If we just come to the aviation sector, what might be use of proceeds in the aviation sector? Well, this is a summary here. Again, shouldn't be too many surprises here. I would say for your part of the aviation sector, it will be the top three. Will be the main areas: the investment in new efficient fleet, the investment in new fuels, sustainable fuels, and investments in traffic management will be critical high capital cost items that, subject to certain conditions, and we'll talk about those perhaps by reference to some examples, can then be identified as either green or possibly transition, and we'll talk about that concept as well, use of proceeds, and therefore funded by this pool of capital that's committed and focused on sustainable investment, sustainable financing. The other area, I think, for the aircraft sector, the circular economy, down sort of 3/4 of the way down the screen there, again, very important around decommissioning, recycling, and so forth, going to be critical to sort of improvement in life cycle impact of the aircraft and the airline industry. And as we'll talk about, it's not just the operation of the machine, it's how's it made, how's it operated, yes, but also how is it used. All of those three items need actually to be considered in determining whether an investment is going to be suitable and eligible for sustainable financing. So a lot of detail has to go into the analysis here for any specific case. I did mention previously the review process. So to ensure market integrity, to ensure robustness of both loans and bonds that are labeled in this sort of use of proceeds approach, there are a number of different ways of getting those assured. The most popular by far is top left here, second party opinions. About 80% of the market is assured by second party opinions. You can see some of the sort of ESG consultants who provide those opinions, and really what they're doing is desktop work, and it's an opinion on, and I'll just focus on the green part here, will these investments or the business that's being financed deliver environmental benefits? An opinion on that. And does the governance structure of the labeled deal meet best market practice? So that's generally the opinion is addressing those sort of the two legs to the opinion. There are other approaches, notably in China, they use limited assurance reports from audit firms quite extensively. There are other approaches that can be used, most notably, I think, climate bond certification. Many say this is one of the highest standards, because the difference with the climate bond standards is they're public standards. So you can see the standards in the public domain, and then your bond can be certified or verified against those standards. And the Climate Bonds Certification Board has now built out a pretty comprehensive set of standards across sectors. And where they are at the moment is now expanding that into what we might call the transition sectors. And transition, as we'll talk about more in a moment, is, I think, something very relevant to the aircraft industry, recognizing that there isn't a 2050 ready solution for broad application across the industry today. So investing in efficiency improvements in line with a transition pathway that gets us to zero by 2050 is critical, and climate bond standards are a very good reference point for understanding that. And there are other techniques as well. And then just to sort of complete the picture, there are a few in individual markets. Just mentioned here in Hong Kong, we have our own homegrown green financing certification. There are similar in other markets. And the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, have a green bond assessment tool. Frankly, it hasn't been terribly popular because it's a rating, and most issuers prefer not to have to deal with a second rating. In fact, Moody's had a product that they withdrew. Moody's now has actually acquired Vigeo Eiris, who you can see top left as one of the leading second-party opinion providers. So Moody's is now focusing its offering on bond and loan external review assurance into the second-party opinion service provision. So these are important to get robust transactions. An example of where a use of proceeds transaction has recently been used in the airline industry. It's not aircraft, but it's an airport. So Delhi International Airport. This was just closed last month. $450 million US, approximate 4.5 year deal, raised in green format with a second party opinion from Cicero. Very successful transaction. Delhi Airport, as many of you might be aware, is a leader in terms of sustainability. I think they're the only airport that has got a 4+ rating from the airport carbon accreditation system. Principally, the proceeds here are going to greening of their terminal buildings, i.e. going beyond business as usual in investment at the airport to drive better environmental performance. One of the things that I think is relevant here across the sector, because of course Delhi is an expanding airport, or expected to expand as soon as we get back to traveling again post-COVID. And the green finance, generally the rule is that you can't really use green finance to fund pure expansion. It needs to be allocated to something that is going beyond business as usual in terms of sustainability outcomes. So we had a good discussion with Cicero around, for example, the Eastern Cross taxiway that Delhi Airport is building. And there was a view that that probably sounds more like that's part of the broader expansion, although obviously having the cross taxiway actually has big carbon benefits in terms of getting aircraft from stand to top of the runway, and vice versa, getting them from the runway back to the gates and so forth. So there are some quite interesting areas. The EU taxonomy has just actually flagged, or some of the consultants in Europe have flagged some of the interesting things that Delhi Airport is doing around taxi bots. So I think had those been were they electric taxi bots, they'd have absolutely been includable under the scope. So this is effectively a machine that gets the plane from the gate to the runway without a very significant reduced burn of jet fuel. So obviously a lot of work that's going on the ground, much of it though needing to be done together with the aircraft. Other uses of proceeds in Delhi, they've got ground power systems, air traffic control, ground management systems, renewable energy, so everything from solar panels on the terminal buildings, waste treatment. Delhi had set some very, very high standards. So they were able to take their, we are delivering a service with the least impact possible, and get the expenditures that were facilitating that funded from this ever-growing pool of green capital. And you'll see in the moment some of the advantages and benefits from doing that. In the aircraft sector, we haven't seen a green bond yet in the for the airline industry. We've seen a transition bond, which I'll talk about. We have seen a green loan. I think this is back in 2018. Braathens, for some new ATR turboprops, secured a green loan, and that was endorsed by Vigeo Eiris. So green is possible. To get that endorsement, we weren't directly involved in the trade, but to get that endorsement, they had to show technology improvements. I think in that case, the machines were going to basically short-haul flights, mainly within Scandinavia, within the Scandinavian region, were delivering travel, or the plane was operating about 30% more efficiently in terms of CO2 per sort of passenger kilometer than the incumbent or the alternatives. But also there was review on the manufacturing base, so ATR's manufacturing base in France, and also there was an assessment on actually the use. Was there an alternative use or alternative solution, I should say, for the travel, because it was because it was across water within the Scandinavian region? Clearly not, and that was a critical part of the assessment, and why that investment could then be labelled as green and eligible for green loan financing. Other airports, it's not just Delhi. We've seen Mexico, Schiphol, Swedavia Group also raise green funding. So in a sense, the product is well tried and well tested for the airport sector. If I've gone a little bit dark, that's because our office lights at whatever we are 9:42 p.m. have now shut down, so I'm relying on my table lamp. This is part of our commitment to saving energy, of course. In this next section, I'll just talk about the other type of product, and this is the sustainability linked product. So remember, we've got the two: we've got use of proceeds and sustainability linked. Sustainability linked, there are principles. So there are sustainability linked bond principles. That's what I mentioned was June 2020. Actually, the sustainability linked loan principles came in April 2019. So it was really the loan market that drove sustainable linkage. But again, the sort of the architecture of the product is similar. It's about identifying a KPI that's relevant to the business, establishing ambitious targets to be achieved against that KPI, and then setting out the what happens if the target is or is not met. And I mentioned before, in the bond market, generally what happens if the issuer fails to meet the target, then the coupon steps up. If the issuer in the loan market, there's an opportunity where if the borrower meets the target, there can then be a step down in margin. So a difference of approach there between the loan and the bond market. Pillar 4, reporting. Clearly there needs to be reporting, and it's very important in these transactions that in any sustainability linked deal, the issuer or the borrower is demonstrating its commitment to overall transition and overall commitment to sustainability, and that the KPIs and targets are relevant to a substantial portion of their business and are creating an alignment towards those ultimate objectives like net zero by 2050. Pillar 5 for these sustainability linked deals is critical, because you've effectively got the KPIs embedded in the deal terms. So there needs to be an independent verifier as to whether the SPT has been met or not, and that then drives the adjustment of pricing, the payment of the premium, or the reduction of the margin in the loan facility. Some examples again of where this has been used. The first one again is in the is in the airport sector. Sydney Airport did a sustainability-linked loan back in 2019, 1.4 billion Aussie dollars, about a 5-year tenor deal. And their target by 2025 was to get their Sustainalytics ESG, not their score, but their ranking into the top 5%. And I think if I'm right, as of today, they're about 18 out of 158 in their group. So to get into the top 5%, they need to improve their ranking from 18 up to about 8. If they do that, then they will get a step down in the loan margin. Now, the other concept I just want to talk about briefly is this concept of transition finance, because this is very relevant to what are often referred to as the sort of hard to abate sectors, of which air travel is one of those because of the technology issues. It's also relevant in many other sectors like the steel industry and other manufacturing processes where you can't get quickly to net zero. There's no sort of 2050 ready and widely deliverable and implementable solution. So the key is to be aggressively reducing emissions or the emissions intensity to get on a pathway to zero. That's the concept of transition. As I mentioned before, there are a number of sort of transition standards out there, of which the climate bond standards are very important. This slide here refers to a handbook produced by ICMA. My London-based colleague was leading the work group that developed this around, sort of what does good transition look like, and it goes to all of some of those comments I mentioned earlier around sustainability-linked bonds. But if you want to say your use of proceeds are supporting the transition, you need to address how this fits, how your strategic commitments align to that. You need to address how your commitment is across substantially all of your business. You can't just say, well, I'm transitioning this part of my business, but ignoring the rest. This concept of so-called science-based targets, and that's really, if I can summarize, that's really just showing your pathway to zero, the zero coming from science. There's some complexities there because, of course, while science tells us we have to, in aggregate, get to zero, science doesn't really tell us how the carbon budget is allocated between different players in the economic system. So there has to be an overlay of an allocation methodology in target setting. And typically, you don't want just to have I'll get there by 2050. You want to see a credible set of intermediate targets and actions aligned to delivering against those. And part 4, again, emphasizing the importance of transparency and the need to disclose the progress, report on key performance indicators. If you're going to go to market and say, these are my transition investments, and this is and I want to tap into sustainable finance markets to obtain those. These principles from ICMA came out in December 2020. We've seen transition used across multiple sectors, mostly, I'd have to say, in the gas sector. So gas as an intermediate step between burning coal from power and getting fully to renewable energy. Some early transactions in Hong Kong. That's with one of the earliest, going back to July 17, 3 trades now from Capco, which is the power generation subsidiary of CLP in Hong Kong. We've seen it in Europe in Snam and Cadent gas networks, where there's been investment to take hydrogen into those gas networks. We saw a very interesting transition bond issued by the Bank of China earlier this year, where they're lending into 5 different sectors, and they set standards for that their borrowers would meet, both in China and also in other parts of the world, across a multitude of sectors, including steel, including chemicals, and some of the other manufacturing sort of hard to abate sectors. And then what I think will be of great interest to this group is the transaction that Etihad entered into in October last year that we helped them to structure. This was a transition bond, but as you'll see in a moment, it was also a sustainability linked bond. So perhaps just talk in the next few slides around what Etihad did, or what the financing transaction for Etihad did. So the first thing to note, it was in Sukuk format. Interestingly, Islamic principles align very well to green and social principles. We've seen this in areas, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, where a lot of Sukuk transactions have been done, which have also been labeled as green and sustainable. So in the Etihad case, it was $600 million, 5-year transaction. For anyone who's interested in Islamic financing structures, the underlying assets were the rights to travel. That's the source of cash flow that will ultimately repay the investors under the Sukuk. But the ultimate use of proceeds is, as we'll see in a moment, is for the purchase of highly efficient 787, I think Class 9 and Class 10. But importantly, and to the earlier comments about setting up, if you want to access these markets, the importance of setting out the overall corporate approach, is that Etihad have created a very significant set of sustainability objectives. They are investing in everything from R&D on biofuels to demonstrating sort of that they can run flights that are single-use plastic free. And to the box in the top right, you can see a whole series of initiatives. And importantly, amongst those, making their commitment to get to net zero by 2050, with all of those sort of intermediate steps along the way. So that corporate commitment, those broader corporate actions, is setting the framework, setting the foundation for a robust, sustainable financing. The details of the sustainable financing are on the next slide. So Etihad actually produced 2 frameworks. So they produced a framework that covers the use of proceeds and aligns to broadly the ICMA use of proceeds principles. This framework is summarized here. So here you can see the use of proceeds that are around energy efficiency. It's replacement of old fleet with 787 9s and 10s. There are exclusions that they committed to, that there are certain things that they would not be investing in. And you can see summarized on this page in their framework how they've addressed each of those 4 pillars of the use of proceeds bond principles. The governance, how they've got committees who are going to evaluate the projects, and how they're also doing reporting on how the funds have been used, and also the performance of the fleet that is being acquired. So this bond was a transition use of proceeds bond, and then, as we'll see on the next page, it was also a sustainability linked bond. So in addition to committing where the proceeds are used, they also, in the payout mechanism for the Sukuk, they have set targets around carbon dioxide per revenue ton kilometer, and set a target to reduce that by 18% over a period of I think five years. And if they fail to achieve those reductions, then the penalty they pay is that they will then buy CORSIA qualifying offsets to meet the gap in terms of any CO2 that they didn't save, or any shortfall in meeting their target. So here you have a transaction with an airline, a huge strategic corporate commitment to transition, using the proceeds of a financing to buy efficient fleet, and at the same time committing to certain performance delivery of not only that fleet, but their overall portfolio of passenger aircraft, and willing to be accountable and willing to pay up a penalty if they fail to meet these targets. So I think in this transaction, what Etihad very successfully did, and yes, it was very successful as a financing, but they've also clearly committed and clearly demonstrated, and in a sense shifted, I think, thinking around the both commitment and what's going on in the sector, but also demonstrated how, you know, the aircraft sector can tap into sustainable financing. Just a word after all of that technology as to why. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that there's pricing benefit for doing this. There are three measures we've used here. We just used the Asian portfolio for this, but we can see primary green bonds, or GSSS, so the whole sustainable bonds market, higher levels of subscription for GSS bonds versus conventional bonds. And that's driving, on the right-hand side, better market outcomes in terms of new issuance premiums for GSS bonds when they go to market. And post going to market, we're seeing some benefit left over for investors, because post-launch, those bonds tightening versus non-GSS bonds. So the credit markets are now clearly giving value for good sustainability. As an issuer, you can get your deals away slightly cheaper, or you've got a good expectation you'll get your deals in primary away at slightly cheaper. There's good expectation that your green deals will trade tight of the overall curve in secondary market trading, because there's this strong demand from long-term take and hold investors to hold this paper. And again, we've seen the benefit of, in another piece of research, seen the benefit of how launching a green framework can not only help your green issuances, but can actually tighten your whole yield curve. So launching a green framework is a very good way of communicating your commitment to sustainability, and issuers who do that in a robust and compelling way are then seeing that benefit all of their debt cost across their curve. So if you're wondering why do it, this is why do it, and this is why I said at the outset that really getting your sustainability story right, whatever sector you're in, is critical to maintaining best market access. Another illustration of how markets are moving, and this is just an illustration over 2020 of a couple of indices here. What we've compared over the year here, so the red line is FTSE All World Index. So these are equities here, and then we've compared that with stocks that appear in the top 35%, and I think we used MSCI here as ESG leaders, and that's the grey line, and that has shown some outperformance over the year versus the FTSE All Share Index. And then another product that we've launched using our Climate Solutions database is where we look at the proportion of revenues of an issuer that come from what we call green sectors, which again is principally all of those sectors we talked about earlier: renewable energy, clean transport, energy efficiency, green buildings, and so forth. And the black line is the performance of the stocks that have greater than 50% of green revenues. And the outperformance there is staggering in terms of percentage incremental return over the year. You can see it's more than double versus the FTSE All Share. Is there a COVID factor here? Maybe, but I think actually what COVID has actually done is just sort of accelerated this widening of the gap. And you can see how the three benchmarks traded through the year as various events happen. But the concept again that markets, and this is beyond credit markets, this is stock markets, this is equity valuations, markets giving clear value for good sustainability performance. And there's an awful lot of this data and analysis out there. I'm just picking a few examples here. In the last piece, And I think we're okay for time, and Neil's jump in if I'm overrunning. I just wanted to talk a little bit about banks specifically, and what banks are doing. Banks are, as always, under huge pressure from their regulators to do more business in sustainable sectors, but also, and thinking back to the global financial crisis, to ensure that climate risks aren't going to be the next major disruptor of the financial system. So regulators globally, and these are principally central banks or prudential regulators, now putting huge pressure on commercial banks and financial institutions more broadly to show how they are assessing and managing climate risk on their books. And there's a complex series of steps that the banks are now being asked to take. The pressure on them, though, is now being consolidated through this entity called the NGFS, so the Network for Greening the Financial System, where there are now more than 60 of the world's biggest regulators, as I say, central banks, prudential regulators, now acting, as it were, in concert around climate risk. And I've just mentioned a few of the the bigger names here, and it's Asia, it's Europe, and I'm quite sure we will start to see, and we already are starting to see, the machinery in the US now starting to put much more focus onto this challenge and the risks in the financial system that need to be managed. Now, disclosure is a key part of how not only financial institutions but corporates are being driven to manage this. So regulators saying, you need to disclose how you're managing it. Perhaps the most notable, although it's not the only approach, TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This was set up under the FSB, so I think it was led by Bloomberg. It goes way back, and they made recommendations on key components of disclosure that financial institutions and banks should provide around, how they are setting up governance structures to manage the risk, how they're strategizing and planning around these risks, how they're analyzing risks, and very importantly, how they are setting metrics and targets to show improved management of these risks. And of course, then to report on this, obviously in the system today, a lot of the regulatory influence comes around not telling people what they do, what they have to do, but telling people what they have to report. So that's why a lot of the regulatory influence is via regulatory requirements. This is TCFD. It's coming through the bank regulators. It's coming through the securities market regulators as well. There are big initiatives being driven by the UN and at the World Economic Forum around consolidation and alignment of reporting approaches such as SASB and GRI, which will affect not just financial institutions, but all corporates as well, and not just within financial institutions, not just banks, but it's insurance companies, it's money managers, and so forth. And one piece just to illustrate the depth of work that's being asked to be done here within the category of risk management, the key tool that TCFD talks about is scenario analysis. And it's like financial stress testing, but multiplied by a huge factor, because we're talking about multi-decade scenarios, at least 3 decades, taking us through to that 2050 period, where now commercial banks, through NGFS and the prudential regulators, are asked to model their business, which is the performance of their borrowers through this transition period. So they was having to set up models. These are models which capture both the Earth system as well as the financial and economic system. So they're what in modeling speak are called integrated assessment models. These are highly complex. Economists have won, within the last few years, these are sort of, it's the lifetime work of Nobel Prize winning economists. Banks are now being asked to start with a rather controlled way, start to set up frameworks for using these types of models for multi-decade scenario analysis. There are climate scenarios in there. And broadly, there are 3 climate scenarios in the first round, or the pilot phase. There's the sort of the orderly transition, following one of those, either the grey or the blue curve from my first slide. A disorderly transition where we do nothing for 10 years and then we virtually go cold turkey on carbon, to the so-called hothouse scenario, where we get runaway temperatures and we go to 4 degrees centigrade. And then what you have to do with the model is you have to put each of your clients' business into the model and look what happens to it. And that is assessed by looking at how their financial statements or how their financial position will be affected. And then typically you run sort of credit rating agency metrics against those projected financial statements, and see where you get the big hits, because you get these radical downgrades or deterioration in rating. And conceptually, every client needs to go into these models. So if you're a borrower, you or some proxy of you is being assessed through these multi-decade models by the banks that you're talking to and asking for them to lend you money. So it's quite a sobering exercise. This is massively complex. There's a huge challenge around data. How do we get the right data? Because the models not only assess the transition risk, i.e. whose business gets squeezed because they're left with stranded assets, but also the models assess the physical impacts. So who owns a building that's susceptible to flooding or storm damage, for example. So you have to load up an awful lot of data to do this. This is not going to happen within 12 months, but this is an absolute priority task. I dread to think how many people within HSBC we now have dedicated to this type of analysis. It's in the hundreds. It's that important, and rightly so. And our approach will be not just to do this for the request of the regulator, or meet the request of the regulator, but it's actually going to become critical to us for how we then strategically allocate our portfolio. So, to conclude, what next? Well, I think we've talked a lot about the top 3 there: changes in operations, changes in technology, changes in fuel sources, sustainable fuels that will be needed to take your industry towards on the pathway to zero carbon. I think there are some big question marks down the bottom, but actually opportunities here. Consumer behavior, of course, will initiatives like flying shame catch on again? Or can the industry actually reposition the perception of the industry? And perhaps Etihad is a good example here of actually the true commitment to actually address and participate in the challenge. I personally think there are huge opportunities there. On the regulatory side, we haven't talked about it, but we should mention the spectre, if I can use that word, of carbon pricing. And the reason I mention it is because in all of those integrated assessment models I talked about on the previous slide that show transition pathways, carbon pricing is the single, not the only, but the single biggest driver of the transition. So in those macro models, it's carbon pricing that is driving the scenarios that are causing a shift of capital from high carbon to low carbon sectors. Now, we know today we have carbon pricing in certain areas of the world, and maybe 15 or 20% of global economic activity is subject to carbon prices. A lot of that through the European Union regulatory scheme. But when will we see broader application of carbon pricing? Should the aviation industry get ahead of the curve on that and consider? Obviously, you have the CORSIA scheme. Can you go beyond CORSIA as part of perhaps a constructive set of initiatives linked to maybe some of the things that you want to be engaging with your customers on, because you've got bankers like me who are being told by their boss, well, you need to cut back on your business travel, Jonathan. So, but I think the the industry may feel, I suppose, to many, a bit like we've almost gone back to, not quite, but gone back to 1903, and we've really got nobody flying, and we have to sort of rebuild it. Now, clearly, we have a lot of what we're going to need. And I would suggest that if the industry gets this right, this could be the most exciting industry again to be working with as the industry deals with these challenges. And of course, if you are going to deal with these challenges, you're going to need the brightest minds to come in and to support industry growth and development. The groundwork is all robust, from, as the pictures on the right there show, commitments around, amongst the industry players, investment that's going on in the fuels space. And certainly from our perspective as a bank, it's absolutely our mission, and frankly it's our job, to support you and your industry partners in meeting this challenge, which of course for us is bringing the capital needed to deliver the solutions that are going to deliver the transition. And with that, I'll pause, and Niels, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was very interesting. And I think we have a few questions that came in. I also have some questions, but I'm going to turn over to Peter.
Yes, thank you, Niels. Yeah, two questions at the moment for you, Jonathan. And first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. Very, very insightful. And can I also just say to those still online, please submit your questions through the Q&A box that you'll find the icon there at the bottom of the screen. The first question is from Guna, who asks the questions: how can the banks work with other institutions like insurers to support airlines?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. It's going to be critical. And we've seen challenges in other sectors, notably in, for example, the energy sector in Asia, where there is this sort of question mark around the role of coal. What's the role of coal in Asia? And we've seen both banks and insurers stepping away from financing coal-fired power plants, and as part of a transition approach. And I think what needs to be addressed here is to really understand that the role of insurers as, in a sense, the providers of efficiently priced risk mitigation products, and perhaps pricing differentials for a sustainable solution that's sustainable not only in an environmental sense, but also in an airline that's going to be sustainable, or a business, a lessor that's going to be sustainable in the financial sense, but also aligning to insurers as investors of capital. And how do we make sure that there is a coordinated and smart approach taken by providers of capital, whether it's banks and insurers as investors, and also that there's a smart approach to consistent approach to understanding the risk. So if the question, I think there is an important role to make sure that the different bits of the financial services sector coordinate, so that we make consistent decisions, and that we make the right decisions in terms of what to support, as well as obviously the challenge here is there are going to be certain parts of the industry that may not be able to be supported if they can't align to transition. So I think that's, I like the question, because I think the coordination and cooperation is going to be key. Although financial institutions like us, we have interests in different parts, I think between the sectors generally, I don't think lending banks and insurers necessarily communicate and collaborate as well as they might do, to make sure we get the support to the right places.
Okay, excellent, thank you. We have a few more questions coming in for you. From Oliver, there's the question of when do you think we will see the first airline green bonds being issued?
Oh, I don't know. I think my crystal ball has turned off for the night. I think we will. You know, I mentioned the European case, the Brabants case. I think a lot of this is around why I wouldn't rush for this. And I think the Etihad approach was smart, because the thing with sustainability is you can very easily get criticized for over-claiming your green credentials. So I think what Etihad did was they said, look, we're an airline. We know we're buying big machines that are burning hydrocarbons and emitting carbon emissions. So we're going to put this within the transition bucket. So that's a sort of a more conservative story, as it were, to making sure you get good and positive response to the efforts that you're making, and avoid the criticism that you might get. And there's that, you know, that nasty greenwashing word that we want to avoid, that somebody who's actually trying, you know, making big efforts, big commitments, then gets criticized because, you know, in a sense, they are claiming that they're doing more than they are. There are some good standards now out there around sort of pathways, and the EU taxonomy, or the EU taxonomy document, or the thresholds within it, I think are also very useful for identifying these pathways. So I think showing alignment to those, the sort of the concept of science-based targets, is a better way to go than marketing yourself as green. So get below the label into looking at exactly what you're targeting to do, be transparent, set targets, and work with investors. I think that's the right way to approach for a, you know, for a tough to abate sector like the aircraft industry. That's a better way to approach it than rather than think, and I know Oliver's not asking the question, but if anyone was thinking, wouldn't it be great to do the first green bond? I'm honestly not sure it would. I think it'd be much better to distinguish yourself because you're clear in your commitments, clear in your ambition, and clear in setting and making yourself accountable to your own targets.
Okay, excellent. And one question from Yogesh is that how can banks help accelerate the transition such that airlines are able to introduce newer, more efficient aircraft sooner?
Well, I think it's got to be a matter of bring your story forward. The capital is there. I tried to make that point early on. Clearly, you know, it's going to a little bit depend on where you're positioned, but I think any upgrade that positions you as a leader in an industry where I think we all have to acknowledge that, you know, there are going to be some big changes, is the way you're going to get support from banks. And being hesitant in these circumstances, not just because of the transition, but also because of, you know, and I'd be interested in your views, Peter and Niels, on this, what people think might have happened to underlying demand. My sense is that we must have seen a little bit of an adjustment to that as we started all of these new, you know, communication processes, that now the prize and the reward for getting ahead of this, in terms of the support you'll then get from your financial partners, will be very significant.
Thank you. And the last question I probably shouldn't pose to you. It might be a little unfair, but somebody's asking about specifically older technology aircraft becoming the coal power plants of the aviation finance. But given you're not a specialist in our area or an appraiser of assets, it might be a little bit unreasonable to expect you to answer that. But interesting to consider.
Yeah, Peter. Look, thank you for defending me. I mean, I wouldn't comment on the specific machines, but I mean, conceptually, yes. The oldest, least efficient part of the fleet, we know will need to be retired, and the question is, how do we do that? Because it will be very difficult to get them financed. And there are, you know, I talked about carbon pricing, and I know it's a really tough one, particularly, you know, when you're coming out of COVID, and the last thing you want is sort of to be having to bear price increases, or your end users bearing price increases as you're trying to get people flying again. But is there some mechanism where, you know, we could create pools of funding that will support the decommissioning or earlier retirement of the older parts of the fleet? Could that be part of a package here? I don't know, but I suspect we're going to need to have, you know, some creative thinking to, you know, resolve you know, those challenges, because there will be undoubtedly, to the question, in my view, there will be stranded assets out there.
Well, there would be a lot of airlines that would love a cash for clunkers type program at the moment, that's for sure. Neil, so that's all we have, so I'll hand it back to you.
I have a question that is on my mind, and I think for a lot of the people in the audience, there is an elephant in the room here, and that is that while there are opportunities to lower the emissions per revenue passenger kilometer, the problem is that we are all in an industry that has enjoyed 5% plus growth in the last 25, 30 years. And by the sheer growth, I mean, it's going to be very, very tough here. So I was curious when you mentioned that HSBC had set internal targets for their own emissions, so to speak. So I was just curious to hear from you, Jonathan, if those targets have affected the travel policy for the bank. For example, are you now struggling to get permission to travel to see your customer, you know, by airplane, or do you have to take a sailing boat to get to your customer?
Well, I mean, I'm not struggling with approvals because there's nowhere to travel at the moment. Being based in Hong Kong, I can perhaps talk more to colleagues who are based, for example, in China, where you can travel. And yes, of course, we are traveling. You need to travel to do business, but I mean, and it's too early to tell what, you know, how the volumes compare. But I'll be pretty sure there will be less business travel. Now we've started to use these alternative means of communicating. I think it's inevitable. I wouldn't like to put a percentage to it. And this, I think, is exactly to your point, you know, who knows? Have we just had that step down and then we'll have to grow back from a slightly lower base, because maybe part of the market will have, you know, it's a sort of a form of modal shift, right? We've gone from, you know, business travel to business Zoom. And that, of course, makes it more challenging for growth to help finance the, you know, consistent upgrading of the fleet. But maybe to Peter, to your point, and I put a question back to you, because you said be some airlines that wouldn't mind a cash for clunkers scheme, but would airlines in exchange for that collectively agree a voluntary carbon pricing system? So you agree a pricing system across everyone, so nobody's disadvantaged, other than, yes, you've got to assess what's the elasticity of demand. And then those receipts are then used to support a cash for clunkers program.
That's an interesting concept. I'm not sure I could give you the sort of a full answer right now, but the only problem you get in that scenario is that you're effectively, so if you think of a lot of the growth is in emerging markets, but a lot of the older assets are in developed markets, you go back to this conundrum you get in many circumstances where the emerging world end up paying to renew and refresh the fleet of the developed world. And it's not normally meant to be that sort of capital flow in that direction, right? But the concept, is interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Peter, did you have any other questions at this point?
Online, no, we don't.
Okay. All right. So with that, I really want to thank Jonathan and Peter for participating. I think this was very interesting. That gave us a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for listening in. We see you back on the 28th of April.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Niels, Peter, thank you very much. And great pleasure to join with you. Look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone.
Definitely. Thank you.